So today, Betsy and myself are going to be talking about pre-breeding comfort and nutrition. Just as a reminder, this program is hosted by the CCE North Country Regional Ag Team. So there's myself, Lindsay Ferlito, and my coworker, Casey Heifers, as well as the CCE South Central New York Dairy and Field Crops team. And Betsy Hicks will be presenting for the second half today. So just as a reminder, this is week 3, and we've got another 5 weeks coming up. So make sure to keep tuning in for the next 5 Fridays. Sorry, my slides are not changing. There we go. Also want to say thank you to our sponsors. Because of them, we've been able to offer this program free of charge to all of our attendees. So thank you to Diamond V, Zimpro, Pool and Grain, and Arm & Hammer for making that possible. So today, what Betsy and I are going to cover some basics on heifer inventory and behavioral considerations around that pre-breeding age, the ABCs of heifer housing, some nutritional considerations, utilizing body condition scoring for this age group, and then pulling it all together with management and some bigger picture stuff and some ways to kind of just do some checks and balances to make sure we're staying on target. So first off, heifer inventory. So before we start breeding all these animals and investing in them a little bit more, we need to make sure we know how many we actually need. So hopefully these calculations have already been done, even in the milk phase before weaning. But if not, make sure we're doing it at this stage. Like I said before, we're investing a little bit more money into them and breeding them. We need to know how many heifers we actually need on the farm. So there are some pretty simple calculators out there. It doesn't take too much to figure it out. But basically, the information that we're going to need is your current herd size or your desired herd size. So obviously, if you're hoping to grow by 100 cows in the next year or two, you're going to want to be inputting those numbers so that you're getting to that level. Your age at first calving on your dairy, your cull rate, non-completion rate, your calving interval, your calf sex ratio, so taking into consideration if you're using any sex semen, as well as calf mortality. So basically figuring out where we're at, where we want to be, you know, our loss rates and our calving age and rates, and then figure out how many of these animals we actually need to keep. And then from there, decide who we're going to breed. So kind of taking the next steps from following up with last week when we talked about those transition age heifers, those younger girls that are around that, you know, 6-month age. Now looking at some of these bigger heifers, moving up to that pre-breeding age, we can start to group these girls in larger groups, but we still want to make sure that we're keeping in mind how we're planning on managing those groups. So obviously larger groups means a greater age range. So still keeping tabs on that. And it's suggested that the max spread is 4 months of age within a group, or about 200 pounds. And that will help with when we're getting to that timing of breeding, is figuring out which animals to be bred. If we have a tighter age range, then most of those animals hopefully are reaching that target at a similar time. And then understanding too that based on how we're housing these animals, that we have the housing to match it. So if we're talking about breeding heifers, where are they being housed? Is there a way that we can breed them in their pen, or how are we going to do that? And again, monitor stocking density and our space allowances to make sure that we're reducing that competition and social stress in these animals. So Gordy Jones from Wisconsin always talks about the ABCs of cattle welfare. So it applies here too to our heifers. So A is air. So we need to make sure that we've got good ventilation. We're going to touch on that a little bit. So good ventilation as well as some heat abatement. B is for bunk. So we still have to be providing access to feed and water throughout the day. And we'll talk about some of the space recommendations. And then C is comfort. So where is she laying down? Does she have access to a clean, dry resting area that's sized appropriately for her needs? So at this age group, we can introduce freestalls now. And obviously we want to size those stalls up as these groups get bigger. So a lot of times on larger herds, you'll see that have, you know, multiple pens of heifers. We're going to see those groups getting bigger as you go down the barn. We can still utilize bedded packs, but our space requirements have gone up now because these animals have gotten bigger. So we're looking at least 50 square feet of bedded space for these animals in that 12 to 18 month range. Reminder again, these heifers need bedding. So we want to see something more like the bottom picture, but maybe with some of that bedding being leveled out compared to that top picture. Still want to try to keep it clean and dry. And especially now that we're looking into breeding and maybe trying to pick up some heat and stuff, and these girls are getting a little more active, really want to make sure we've got some non-slip grooved flooring so that these girls are staying, keeping their hooves sound and not getting injuries, and that we're able to catch those heats. This is from the University of Wisconsin. They provide a lot of really great freestall dimensions based on cattle size. So they give it based on body weight with the kind of estimated age range in months at the top there. And then we've got our different aspects of stall dimensions. So stall width, length, neck rail placement, brisket board, if there is one, and where it's located and how big it is. So I'm not going to walk through each of those numbers, but that information is there. And it's just a good reminder too, that if you haven't already checked out University of Wisconsin's Dairyland Initiative website, it's free. And like I said, they've got some awesome resources. One of the main ones is this Freestall Dimensions. And like I said, it sizes up so we can see what it is for heifers of this age. And then you can go and check it out for all the way up to mature lactating cows as well. So again, just keeping in mind, those stalls need to grow as those heifers are growing. Feed and water space. There's kind of some ranges depending on who you ask, and recognizing too that we're going to have some ranges in these groups, but we're looking at about 18 to 22 inches of space per heifer. And again, you can kind of see in that top right picture, the pen to the far right is smaller, and then we kind of size up a bit as we're getting down the line of heifers. We also need adequate water space, so about 2 to 3 inches per heifer. And we'd like to see at least 2 water troughs in each pen so that we can't have a dominant heifer monopolizing that one water. And we're giving those heifers some opportunities to access water. If they can't get to that one, they've got another one they can access. And again, making sure that water is clean. So looking at the ventilation side of things, this is a chart from Kurt Gooch at Cornell Pro Dairy, and looking at ventilation rates for our replacement heifers. So if we look on the left-hand side there, we've got different age groups. So the newborn group, that transition group that we talked about last week, and then getting into the adolescent age categories. So kind of leading up to breeding and then after breeding. So just a couple considerations too with ventilation. There's a couple different ways of looking at it. We need to make sure that we're considering the size of the barn. So when we're talking about air exchange rate, so air exchanges per hour. So a lot of times we talk about maybe about 6 changes per hour in colder temperatures, up to 60 changes an hour in warmer temperatures. So basically every minute we want the volume of that barn, we want that complete volume of that barn to be exchanged with fresh air. But if you take that same volume of the barn and we add a lot more heifers and we start overcrowding those heifers, we obviously need better ventilation because now we've got more animals, we're going to have more waste, more smell. So we do also need to consider that stocking density and consider it as how much air we're moving per head of animal. So just to be kind of keeping those two things in mind, that we need to look at the barn itself, as well as how many animals we're putting in that barn. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about heat abatement. So just making sure that we're thinking about heat abatement for these animals as well. We've kind of talked about how sometimes heifers kind of get forgotten about in terms of different things. We've got her in a pen, we've got her in stalls, she's got feed and water, she's good to go. But I just wanted to make a note that we really need to be making sure that we're setting these girls up for success. And one of those important factors is potentially this heat abatement. So we do get enough days of heat stress here in New York, as well as across the rest of the country, to justify putting in heat abatement, so putting in fans and potentially sprinklers. So if we're looking at heat stress in these heifers in the pre-breeding and then once they're pregnant, we see increased water intake, reduced dry matter intake, compromised reproduction, and it can potentially also lead to reduced colostrum quality when they freshen for the first time, as well as have negative impacts on her calf, on that calf size and health. So basically, not only are we potentially reducing her chances for success, but we're also then potentially reducing the chances of success of her calf and the next generation. And so we're getting this compounding effect. So depending on how you're housing these animals, we need to make sure these heifers have shade. They can get out of the sun. They've got access to water. Make sure that, you know, when it goes up in the summer, that they've got lots of water. We got the proper flow rates to make sure those tubs are staying full. Utilize fans. And again, going back to that stocking density, if we're putting way more animals in a barn than should be there, we're going to need more fans. We're going to need to move more air to get them cooled off. So now Betsy is going to talk about some of the nutritional considerations.
Thanks, Lindsay. So when I think about a heifer program, I'm thinking about what are our goals of our heifer program. And the main things I want to do, I want to maintain health. Absolutely. The things Lindsay talked about are paramount to having a great heifer program. So we're going to maintain health doing the things Lindsay talked about. And then next, I want to achieve our rate of average daily gain targets. And I'm going to talk about those in just a little bit. The other two things, promoting muscle and skeletal growth. We want them to not only gain to be hitting the targets we want, but we want to make sure that they are the right height and muscle to fat ratio. And we want to minimize fat heifers. We don't want to have too much adipose tissue deposition. So 4 main goals we're going to keep in mind as we move forward through these slides. So Lindsay, you can go to the next one if there might be a delay. All right, so talking about these rate of average daily gain targets. So firstly, when I work with herds, what do our mature cows weigh? We ought to know exactly what those mature cows weigh before they're pregnant. And if we don't know that, we got to figure it out. We have to put these cows across scales to figure out what it is, because we can't grow our heifers effectively until we know what a mature average cow in that herd weighs. And then also the other thing we need to achieve this is what are our aged at first calving. We need to know when that heifer is going to freshen, so we know what weight we have to achieve by that time frame. So we want generally we want at calving, heifers should be 85 to 90% of that mature weight, and it's very simple math to back calculate from there. So let's walk through an example. So say we have a 1,500 pound mature cow, which probably is on the lighter side for our typical Holstein cows of today. But for this example, we're going to use 1,500. So our 85% is 1,275 pound heifer at calving. That's what she needs to weigh to be 85%. And for this example, we're going to use 22 months. So say this heifer at weaning at 2 months, she weighs 200 pounds. So 1,275 minus 200, she's got to gain 1,075 pounds over the next 20 months in order to reach our target of 1,275. So if we do that math, it's about 1.8 pounds needed on average if we feed her linearly to have an average rate of daily gain to reach that 1,275. 1.8 pounds. That's pretty darn achievable, but we're going to talk through some strategies to feed heifers differently when they're younger as to when they get a little bit older. And so last week, Casey talked about puberty, and in heifers, like, I don't think people realize what a big deal puberty is. Before puberty, we know heifers will use these nutrients preferentially towards muscle and skeletal growth. And after puberty, she's going to tend to use those excess nutrients to deposit fat on her back. So we need to use that line in the sand to say, okay, where's puberty for our farm? If we're really pushing rate of average daily gains quickly early on, maybe she's reaching puberty as early as 8 months. Maybe it's less. But if we're not pushing rate of average daily gain that hard, maybe it's 10 months. She might arrive earlier if we push it faster. So we need to know, when are you starting to see heifers in heat on your farm? And that kind of tells you where puberty is. So we can manipulate our gains before and after this line in the sand so we can achieve different targets. So important to know where that puberty line falls. So when we're talking about pre-breeding heifers, so we're going to talk on this slide from when they transition after weaning. So that's the period we talked about last week to that puberty line. So we're talking about heifers from, that 400 to 600-700 pound range here. These heifers are super efficient to feed and realize growth. These heifers take nutrients and they grow. It is so simple to feed these babies. And in this situation, the high cow lactating diet works really, really well at achieving our desired growth rates for this group. If you take the diets in a high cow diet and you line them up for what these heifers need, they line up pretty darn well. And it's great to use this high cow diet because we're already making that mix. So we just make a little bit more to line up for these group of heifers. We don't have to make a special mix. So it's less mixer time, it's less labor time. We just need to make sure that we're dropping some for this group every day. That is fresh, good feed. It's relatively inexpensive to feed them because the lactating diet is really expensive. When you feed 55 to 60 pounds to a lactating cow, sure. But when we're feeding it to a heifer diet, boy, per head per day, this is a pretty economical feed and we can achieve our growth rates. And so, we can get this 2.2 pounds per day really, really easily using this high cow diet. It's definitely attainable. And if we think back to all the things that we've learned about growing calves, our early growth is preferential, not only for the cost, because they're growing really efficiently, but all of the benefits we get from growing heifers good from the start. All of those things we're going to realize by focusing on this group and really pushing the nutrients to these heifers at this stage. So now we're talking from puberty to breeding. So hopefully we're not breeding our heifers when they first come in puberty. Probably want still a little bit more growth on these calves before we're breeding them. These heifers, that 600, 700, 800 range, these heifers are still really efficient at transforming those nutrients to frame and muscle. However, we're getting to the point where these nutrients are starting to get pushed towards adipose, puberty, we're transforming how they're using their nutrients. So careful attention to the diet is super, super important in this situation. That lactating diet can still work, but we're going to use our rules of body condition scoring in these groups, like Casey talked about last week. We're going to use our body condition scoring to make sure that we're not overfeeding nutrients. And we can dilute this diet down with some poor haylage as necessary to achieve our body condition goals. And in this diet, maybe we back to that 1.8 pounds or 2 pounds per head per day. The nice thing is we're still achieving our growth targets and we're still doing it really effectively because we're still using that lactating cow diet. And again, I like feeding these heifers early on for a high rate of gain because it costs less. And if we avoid playing catch up later when they're eating a lot of feed, that time frame, it costs a lot of money to feed those heifers because they eat so much feed. So really economical by feeding them early and getting that growth front loaded up front. So we're going to save more money by doing it this way. And they have a better heifer at the end. So I tossed in this slide for some other feeding considerations. So, we hear the term heifer haylage thrown around a lot. So do we mean lesser protein quality feed when we're talking about heifer haylage? And so I just want to remind you guys, younger animals actually have that higher protein needs similar to what we provide in that lactating cow diet. We're going to save those poor quality or lesser protein feeds for bigger heifers who actually need those diluted protein feeds. Their protein needs are not as much as when they're younger. They're not as much as older heifers compared to when they're younger. Say it better. That good quality haylage, it may not be the right thing for the older heifers. That excess protein may need to be diluted, like I talked about. That excess protein can actually be converted into adipose tissue, aka fat heifers. So really, let's make sure we're matching our heifer haylage to the appropriate heifers that need to be eating it, and dilute it if we need to. I lastly put on here limit feeding. I am not a fan of limit feeding. Anybody that's raised heifers knows how destructive they can be. And so that's a number one. We hate, picking up after heifers and keeping heifers safe from hurting themselves by being bored. But also things Casey talked about last week, some of these undesirable feeding behaviors that when they learn them as heifers, these things carry through to when they're mature cows, and we want to stop them before they start. We don't ever want them to pick up on sorting behaviors or pushing behaviors, things that can damage their skeletal frame or their feet. We don't want those things to happen. We want to, let's keep them full. So I'm going to scoot into this body condition scoring section really quickly. And so we're looking, this source is from Elanco Animal Health. It's an older resource, but I still think it's one that's super handy in this situation. So this is looking at a 12-month-old heifer. And in the next 3 slides, we'll see this 2.5 score, a score 3, and a score 3.5. So to orient you to what we're looking at here, so this 2.5 score heifer is on the thinner side. And so we see around her tail head, you can see very prominent pieces of her skeleton, basically. So we see hooks, pins, her tail head is very prominent. And when we look at the side view, we see her ribs and some more of the skeletal form of that heifer. When we move into a score 3, which is where we want to see the majority of our heifers falling, you can see the hips and the pins are a little bit more rounded, but you can still see the shape of the skeleton, and the ribs are less visible. We want the majority of our heifers in a 12-month-old heifer to fit into this score 3. When we look at a score 3.5, you can see this heifer is, got a little bit more condition. The hips and the pins are more rounded even still, and the ribs are not very visible in that side profile picture. So this is a little bit over conditioned for that 12-month-old heifer. We want, like I said, more of our heifers to stay in that score 3 range. So some body condition scoring best practices. We want somebody that's trained in body condition scoring to complete this on a regular basis for our heifer program. A nutritionist or a veterinarian are good options. More so because probably they're trained, but also they don't see these heifers every day. So they're not, don't have blinders on to the same situation. So what we're going to do when we score them, we're going to plot the results of what we see in this same pen. So we can see the average of the group, which is important, but I also want to see the range in body condition scores. So if we have a very big range of body condition scores, that's not necessarily a good thing. We're going to go back to what Lindsay talked about. What is our weight range or age range in the group of heifers? And maybe we need to shorten that up a little bit to get a more consistent body condition score. And we're going to monitor this over time. A lot of herds I do this with, we're monitoring as frequently as monthly. Maybe this is overkill. Maybe every 6 months is okay, or quarterly. That would be great too. Just make sure that we're doing it on a frequent schedule. And then lastly, I want to use body condition scoring with weighing heifers. Using just one of these parameters alone doesn't give the whole story. If we're only using rate of average daily gain or weights, maybe these heifers are putting down too much fat. But if we're using body condition scoring only, are we actually reaching our rate of average daily gain targets? So we want to use them together to get the full story. So lastly, I want to talk about some management for this group of pre-breeding heifers. So some things that when we work with producers or where we work with farms, things that we see, there's always problems when we have slugs of calving, right? We don't calve the same number of cows every month. It can be an issue when we talk about heifer facilities because we're, typically we don't have enough heifer facilities to start with. Some other issues we see regularly are outbreaks of ringworm, respiratory events, and then sometimes we get fat heifers and sometimes we get undersized heifers. So this next slide kind of talks through some of the things that I think about when we're working with some issues. So with slugs of calving, maybe we need to move gates to make pens bigger. Absolutely, those transition times or those trouble pens where we know where if we put too many heifers in them, we're going to have trouble. Let's make those pens bigger. We need to control the stocking density if we know we're going to have a slug of calving. So we have to be flexible to make sure we minimize those transitions, the stress during those transitions. For outbreaks of ringworm, I tell producers all the time, and it's kind of like really intuitive. So if we have outbreaks of ringworm, what are we doing to stress them out? It's only going to happen if their immune system says, no, things aren't good. I'm getting stressed out. I'm going to break out with ringworm. So what are we doing? So if we're putting them in a bigger group, so now she used to deal with 8 calves and now she's with 24 other calves. Did we change the diet? Because if we change the diet at the same time, that is too much of a stressor. Let's not change the diet when we put them in a bigger group. Or if we change location, or if we're teaching them to stalls, don't change too many things. If you see an outbreak of ringworm, What are you doing to them? Let's make sure we're not stressing them out. For respiratory events, there's a lot of times ventilation will be good in one season and then it stinks in the next, like Lindsay talked about. So we can talk a little bit later about using smoke sticks to evaluate ventilation. Fat heifers. So if we're getting heifers that are really fat and it's a whole big group, let's evaluate our diet, protein, and energy. Do we just have too good a protein haylage that we're feeding our heifers? Let's step back and make sure that we're achieving what we want with a diet. And maybe we need to dilute that protein out. And then finally, with our undersized heifers, are we getting our growth targets and reaching our rate of average daily gain? Maybe we need to make our group size smaller and we need to make sure we're hitting those targets. Or if our heifers are coming in too small, do we actually know what our mature cow size is? Maybe we need to push things a little bit faster early on, or we need to push our age of first calving back a little bit. So just some areas to think about. And at this point, Lindsay and I are super happy to take any questions. So thanks so much for listening.
All right, so it looks like we have one question right now, and just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, please go ahead and submit those. So I think this question is for you, Betsy. What are your comments on feeding high amounts of silage before 6 months on rumen development and rumen function?
Yeah, so Casey, you talked about that a little bit last week, and I think Dr. Van Amberg really talks about it a lot too. If we introduce these fermented feeds early on, it's a lot for this rumen that is developing to kind of deal with. So we're pushing a lot of nutrients at this calf to get the rumen to grow and the rumen to function. And we're trying to grow size and epithelial all at the same time. And so I'm sure somebody can answer it far better than me, but I always seem to see when people try to add fermented feeds in a high amount before 6 months, calves just aren't growing the way we want them to. They don't have the absorptive capacity in the rumen to really use the organic acids that are in the fermented feeds. We can maybe start to introduce a little bit, but I don't want to push them to a full diet of fermented feeds before 6 months. I just feel like we do a lot better if we introduce them slowly and then transition after 6 months.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So while we wait for maybe some other questions, I have a question for you, Lindsay. So when you were touching on ventilation, this is an area that seems like a lot of producers have been reaching out with questions on. And are you able to kind of describe to listeners like what steps you would take or what you would actually do to troubleshoot ventilation in some of these calf and heifer barns?
Yeah, and Betsy kind of just started to mention it there with the smoke sticks. So yeah, basically if we have a situation where we have a hunch that ventilation is not working or we want to make sure it is working, there's a couple different things we can do. So one really visual thing is we can use smoke sticks. So it's basically like a little smoke bomb. You light it and it just generates a lot of thick, dense smoke. And so we fill the barn with that. We use the right number of smoke sticks based on the cubic volume of the barn. So we fill the barn up with smoke, and then essentially we just time it and wait and see how long it takes that smoke to clear. So like I said, we have different recommendations depending on the season. So in the winter, it's obviously going to take a little bit longer to clear because we're not getting quite as many air exchanges. But if we did it in the summer, within about a minute, we expect to see most of that smoke gone. The other thing we're looking at is the consistency and kind of the evenness throughout the barn. So we've been doing this a lot with calf barn facilities. And what we found is sometimes on average, the barn has cleared, but there's a section of the barn that has not cleared and it won't clear for a good 10 or 15 minutes. So even though on average the system's working, we've got this one pen of calves or heifers that's not getting the adequate ventilation. And a lot of times the producer says, yeah, we always seem to have trouble with that pen. Usually it's a pen on the end of the barn. And so they have an extra kind of a wind shadow of a wall of the barn, or just the way the fans are designed, they're not angled properly to that pen. So yeah, we want to make sure we're checking every part of that barn to make sure every group of heifers is getting ventilation. We can also use just some handheld wind meters that will measure airspeed. So we kind of do some spot checks, because again, it's like with cows, when it's a nice hot day and you go in a freestall barn and you stand in the feed alley, it feels great because the air is just moving down that feed alley. But then when you walk into the free stalls and start to go into the stalls, you realize how much of that nice airspeed is getting blocked by these physical barriers in the pen. So we can do some spot checks where the heifers actually are, where they're laying down, to make sure we're reaching the targeted air speeds. If we're talking about, checking for tubes or checking fan output, or looking at some heat abatement stuff and making sure we're moving air fast enough.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. So it looks like a good point to wrap up. Just a reminder that next week is going to be Hoof Health with Dr. Doepfer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And same time, same place, same Zoom link. So we hope to see you all there. And just want to take another opportunity to thank our generous sponsors once again for making this program available to participants at no cost. So thank you to Diamond B, Arm & Hammer, Pull & Grain, and Zinpro.